I had just gotten back from flying emergency relief supplies into a wildfire zone when I spotted it. A bright, fluorescent pink notice flapping under my Jeep's windshield wiper. The hood was still warm from the road, but the message slapped me cold. Parking violation, scribbled in curly, mirror-practiced handwriting. And just below that, in bold black marker, someone had scrawled, "Try reading the rules, soldier boy." I didn't need to flip the slip to know who left it. Only one person in Brookhaven Trails dotted her lowercase is with hearts. Sandra Millbrook, the 55-year-old self-declared president of our HOA, and suburban tyrant in a pastel pink tracksuit. That was the moment something shifted in me. If Sandra didn't want my Jeep in the driveway, fine. I'd land a helicopter instead. It all started 2 weeks earlier. I'd just bought the Jeep. Nothing flashy, just a rugged olive drab Gladiator, off-road winch, big all-terrain tires, and a bumper decal that read "Former Air Rescue. I brake for med flights." I was proud of it. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was part of my identity as Logan West, 42, former Army Air evac pilot. But in Brookhaven Trails, apparently, pride was a problem. 3 days in, and I got my first taste of Sandra's HOA madness. She strutted up my driveway like she was storming Omaha Beach, clipboard in one hand, iced latte in the other, then tapped on my driver's side window like I was a criminal. I rolled it down, and she leaned in, smile stretched across a Botox-stiff face. "This neighborhood has an aesthetic standard," she said flatly, "and that thing doesn't meet it." I chuckled. That was a mistake. Her eyes narrowed like I'd insulted her designer poodle. She snapped a photo of my Jeep, jotted a note, and walked off. By dinner time, I had an email from the HOA, urgent compliance issue. They suggested I relocate the unsightly vehicle off-site. I fired back a polite question. Does my driveway count as unsightly, or just my service record? That sarcasm didn't go over well. Next morning, a thick envelope full of code violations arrived in my mailbox. No decals, no utility racks, no vehicles over 72 inches tall parked more than 4 hours. It was like they'd made up half the rules overnight, just for me. I started talking to neighbors. Turns out Sandra had fined Carl Jennings, a retired firefighter, for parking his classic Chevy too close to the curb. She'd even forced another veteran to repaint his American flag-themed mailbox because it clashed with her approved color palette. Most people were good folks, teachers, small business owners, retirees, but whenever her name came up, they all wore the same look, tired, worn down, afraid. The worst part? Sandra had never even been elected. She'd just clung to power long enough, scared off enough people, and now ruled the HOA like a suburban warlord, with a clipboard and the number for the local towing company on speed dial. Still, I didn't want trouble. I parked the Jeep deeper in the driveway, nose nearly kissing my garage door, even turned it so the decals faced away from the street. Didn't matter. One night, after returning late from medevac drills, the Jeep was gone. Vanished. At first, I thought it had been stolen. I was halfway dialing 911 when I noticed a familiar pink slip fluttering on the driveway. HOA vehicle removal, emergency lane obstruction. My driveway. My property. Towed while I was serving on active drills. That was when the calm part of me kicked in. Not rage, focus. I stepped into the garage, passed my flight maps and commendations, and unlocked the steel locker. Inside was my still current pilot's license, tucked between a pair of Army-issue gloves and a laminated airspace chart. If Sandra didn't want a Jeep in my driveway, maybe she'd prefer the thump-thump-thump of rotor blades instead. And so, the idea was born. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to fight. I was going to outfly her, literally. With the help of Trent Dorsey, my old flight buddy at Sierra Ridge Airstrip, I began quietly preparing. I applied for the permits. I leveled my backyard. I said it was for yoga. Sandra wrinkled her nose and warned me not to attract bugs. I smiled. Because soon, Brookhaven Trails wouldn't just hear about the rules. They'd hear the sky roar back. Maybe Sandra would enjoy the roar of rotor blades instead. I didn't tell anyone my plan. No announcements, no warnings, just quiet, deliberate action. Over the course of a week, I started renovating my backyard. I leveled out a section of turf, laid down synthetic grass panels, and framed it with weather-resistant trim. To anyone passing by, it looked like I was prepping a meditation space. When Sandra Millbrook asked what I was working on, clipboard in one hand, suspicion in the other, I smiled and told her it was for yoga. She gave me the same wrinkled nose look she gives to garden gnomes and said, "Just make sure it doesn't attract bugs." Perfect. That same week, I paid a visit to Sierra Ridge Airstrip, where Trent Dorsey, my old flight partner, handled maintenance for charter helicopters. Over lunch in the hangar, we got to talking about FAA regulations, noise thresholds, and the technicalities of helipad use on Cimarron private property. Turns out, in a place like Brookhaven Trails, as long as I wasn't disrupting wildlife or flying over someone's roof, I could land in my own yard with the right permit. So I filed the paperwork. A short-term experimental air operations authorization, listed myself as a medical responder with prior Army Air evac service, attached all my licenses and certifications. 3 days later, I walked out of Sierra Valley City Hall with a signed document in hand. I wasn't breaking the law, I was rising above it. By the time my Jeep Gladiator was finally returned, scratched, dented, and with a busted mirror, I wasn't mad. I was focused. I filmed the damage, cataloged the towing records, and posted a calm, fact-based video titled, "HOA towed my Jeep while I was serving, so I'm taking another route." It exploded. Thousands of views in hours. Comments flooded in with tales of petty HOA presidents, towing nightmares, and creative revenge. One guy offered to ship me landing lights. Another wrote, "Land that bird, brother. Show Sandra what altitude authority really looks like." I hadn't even flown yet, and I already had a fan base. But it wasn't about clout. It was about principle. When people abuse rules, the only way to fight back is with something bigger than a signature. In my case, a rotor blade. So, the next morning, I stood in my garage with my flight helmet in hand, the rising sun slicing across the concrete floor. Off in the distance, I heard it, the unmistakable rhythm of incoming blades. Trent was inbound. I stepped out onto the lawn with my coffee and looked at the mat I'd built. From the street, it probably still looked like a perfectly circular yoga zone. But to anyone with aviation experience, it was something else entirely. A functioning, low-impact helipad, complete with discrete LED perimeter lights and weather markers. Sandra had no idea I'd once designed landing zones and combat zones with nothing but chalk and a compass. Compared to those days, my backyard was practically a VIP runway. Neighbors passed by and gave nods, quiet smirks. Everyone in Brookhaven Trails had heard about the Jeep drama by now. I waved casually. I didn't need a protest. I needed open airspace and a clean descent path. Sandra, meanwhile, was going into full patrol mode. She cruised the block in her HOA-issued golf cart, sunglasses perched on the bridge of her nose, clipboard gripped like a weapon. She made slow, menacing loops, and even snapped photos of me raking the landing mat. I waved again. She didn't wave back. Later that afternoon, I found a folded flyer stuffed in my mailbox. Special Emergency HOA Meeting, 7 p.m. Topic: Unauthorized property modifications and possible aviation threats. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my sandwich. Aviation threats, like I was a rogue drone strike waiting to happen. I could practically see her pacing around, imagining her suburban utopia being shredded by rotor wash. That night, I attended the meeting in a pressed shirt and clean boots, respectful as always. The community hall was packed, standing room only. People who'd never shown up before were now buzzing with energy. Something had shifted. I slid into a seat in the back row, said nothing. Sandra took the floor, her expression grim. She was about to learn what happens when you push the wrong pilot, and the sky starts pushing back. Sandra Milbrook stood at the front of the HOA meeting room like a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. She clicked through a grainy slideshow of surveillance-style images, me laying turf, raking the mat, even a close-up of me holding a clipboard. To hear her speak, you'd think I was constructing a missile silo. "This is a safety issue," she declared, voice sharp enough to slice drywall. "We cannot allow military-style operations in a peaceful, family-oriented community. Children could be traumatized. Pets might bolt. Property values could plummet." There was a pause. Then, from the second row, Carl Jennings raised a hand. Didn't he serve in the Air Force or something? I stood, calm and clear. "Army," I said. "Technically, I flew medevac for the Army's aviation branch." A soft murmur rippled through the room. I saw heads nod. Sandra's expression soured like she'd bitten into a rotten lemon. Then another voice, Angela Wu, a retired nurse, chimed in. "So, let me get this straight. He's certified to land helicopters, and you're worried about noise. Sandra snapped. The HOA has every right to preserve neighborhood character. I raised my hand, holding up a copy of my FAA Air Operations Permit. And the FAA has every right to approve qualified pilots to land on private property under specific conditions, which I meet. The silence that followed was heavy. Sandra turned a deeper red than the HOA logo. She tried to pivot, mumbling about noise ordinances and pollution concerns, but the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. I didn't have to say anything else. I let the paperwork, and her paranoia, speak for me. After the meeting, several neighbors approached to shake my hand. One offered to paint lines for the pad. Another, a hobbyist drone pilot, asked if I wanted help with aerial camera coverage. A third came with his teenage son, Eli Tran, eyes wide with excitement. He's thinking about flight school, the father said. Mind if he watches the landing? Not at all, I smiled. Could be sooner than you think. The next few days were a flurry of quiet prep. I installed a windsock and a compact radio beacon. I mapped out a safe viewing perimeter and even ordered a collapsible sign that read, Active Landing Zone. Keep clear. Not for show, just for clarity. I didn't want chaos. I wanted precision. Controlled, legal, undeniable. Then came the call from Trent Dorsey, my longtime friend and co-pilot from Sierra Ridge Airstrip. I've got an old Bell 206 sitting in the hangar, he said. Not pretty, but legal and light enough to land without blowing the roses off your neighbor's lawn. You fueling it? I asked, or should I? I'll fly you prep. That night, I parked my Jeep Gladiator squarely in the middle of my driveway, like a middle finger to the past, just for old time's sake. And sure enough, around midnight, I spotted Sandra outside pacing, phone pressed to her ear, practically vibrating with fury. I sipped cocoa at my upstairs window, watching the drama like it was primetime television. By dawn, everything was ready. I zipped up my old Army flight jacket, not to show off, but because it was cold and a little sentimental. Neighbors emerged, pretending to check sprinklers or walk their dogs. Some brought lawn chairs. I waved. The wind was still. Then the sound started, low and steady, womp womp womp. Heads turned. Phones came out. And over the ridge, sleek and sure, came the Bell 206. Trent was at the controls, and I raised one arm in signal. The chopper descended slowly, graceful and smooth, blades cutting the air like poetry. Sandra backed into her yard, eyes wide, clutching her latte like it was a shield. The Bell touched down with the gentlest rush of wind. Trent powered down. I opened the side door and helped him out. Nice spot, he said, surveying the mat. Better than half the pads I've landed on. I looked across the cul-de-sac at Sandra. She hadn't moved. She was frozen on her porch, mouth slightly open, latte trembling. I gave her a wave. Morning, Sandra, I called. Hope the noise wasn't too unsightly. She didn't reply, just slammed her front door so hard it rattled the furniture. The neighborhood erupted, not in chaos, but in soft cheers and stunned laughter. Some clapped. Some just stared in disbelief. The man with the teenage son, Eli Tran, brought him over immediately. Trent Dorsey, ever the pro, walked Eli around the cockpit of the Bell 206, explaining the controls with the ease of someone who loved the sky. A few people snapped pictures. Others filmed quietly from their porches. The best part? Every detail, every permit, every measurement was legal, documented, and executed without a single raised voice. The first landing wasn't just a touchdown. It was a message. But I knew Sandra Millbrook wouldn't let it go. She'd made this personal, and now that I'd shown her what a real landing looked like, she would try to strike back. I'd seen her type before, more power than perspective, and I knew something else. No matter how hard she pushed, I was ready to fly circles around her. Monday morning felt different. Still air, bright sun, but something had changed in Brookhaven trails. I walked the loop with my coffee, as I always did, but every neighbor I passed now nodded, smiled, or offered a quiet thumbs up. I wasn't just the guy with the helicopter. I was our guy. A few asked questions about the chopper, curious and respectful. One woman told me her son had already started researching pilot schools. Even Carl Jennings, who usually grunted more than he spoke, tipped his cap and said, "That was the most excitement we've had since the city canceled the 4th of July parade." The mood was shifting. You could feel it. The fear that Sandra thrived on, the whispered compliance, was breaking. And all it took was one legal, strategic act of defiance she never saw coming. Of course, she didn't stay quiet for long. By that afternoon, Sandra had already posted a furious letter on the community bulletin board titled, "The Sky Menace and Its Consequences." Bold font, dramatic flair. She threw out terms like terrorize, airborne nuisance, and public endangerment. She claimed I had violated the community's airspace agreement, which, as any sane person knows, isn't a real thing. I overheard her at the mailbox boasting that she was contacting the FAA, the mayor, and some flight safety attorney. None of them had names, of course, probably because they didn't exist. What Sandra didn't realize was that my entire setup had been crafted with surgical precision. Signed, certified, filed, documented. This wasn't noise for the sake of noise. I was deliberate, and the more she tried to twist it into chaos, the more foolish she looked. But I wasn't naive. Sandra was the type to go down swinging. And sure enough, 2 days later, I pulled into my driveway and spotted a man waiting beside the landing pad, a city inspector. He was polite, clipboard in hand, said he'd received a complaint about unlicensed backyard construction. I didn't argue. I handed him the permit folder and walked him through the site. He flipped through the documents, browsed the FAA stamps, and spent 10 minutes wandering around before glancing at me with a faint smirk. "You're good to go," he said. Honestly, I think someone just wasted both our time. That evening, Sandra made her next move. She marched up and down the block, clipboard swinging, gathering signatures for a proposed motion to ban all aircraft-related activities from HOA grounds. The keyword? Grounds. She had no authority over private backyards. When that didn't stick, she pivoted again. This time, she pushed for a decibel limit on rotor-based noise sources from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. One neighbor immediately asked if that meant lawnmowers were banned. Another joked that Carl's snoring violated it. To her credit, Sandra wasn't dumb, just intoxicated by power. When the rule changes failed, she went theatrical. One afternoon, a local reporter showed up on my porch. Said someone had tipped him off about a renegade pilot disturbing the peace in Brookhaven trails. I invited him in. I showed him the permits, the air operations schedule, my licenses, my logbook. I introduced him to Angela Wu and Carl, both of whom vouched for me. He asked me what I was hoping to prove. "Nothing," I said. "Just that you can push back, legally, calmly, and not let fear rule your street." He nodded, quietly impressed. Then I told him, "Next time Trent flies in, bring your camera. We'll take you up." The story that aired later that week would change everything. The news segment aired the next night. It was titled, "Veteran Pilot vs. HOA. Who's Really Out of Line?" The footage showed Sandra Millbrook pacing furiously on her porch while my neighbors applauded as the helicopter lifted into the morning sky. The camera caught kids waving, lawn chairs lined up like it was an air show, and someone shouting, "There he goes again." Sandra was not thrilled. But her biggest mistake came a few days later when she called the police. It was a calm Saturday morning. I was setting up a few cones near the edge of the yard, prepping for another routine landing from Trent Dorsey. About 30 minutes before touchdown, 2 squad cars rolled into Brookhaven trails with lights off. The officers stepped out and approached slowly, scanning the scene with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. Across the street stood Sandra, arms crossed like a school principal catching a kid skipping class. The officers introduced themselves. Officer Maya Rivera, calm and professional, explained that they had received a report of illegal aircraft activity and possible threats to community safety. I nodded, said nothing, and handed over my binder. FAA permits, flight logs, zoning board approvals, and documentation of my air operations authorization. They flipped through the paperwork, called in a verification, and quietly stepped aside for 15 minutes to confirm everything. When they returned, Officer Rivera gave a small nod. "Sir, you're completely within your rights. Sorry to bother you. We just had to follow up on the report." "No worries," I said. "Want to meet the pilot when he lands?" They actually stuck around. Trent came in clean, touched down like he was landing on glass, and stepped out grinning. The officers took a quick look inside the cockpit, asked a few friendly questions, even posed for a photo with Trent by the rotor. Sandra watched the entire scene from across the street. She looked like she'd swallowed a cactus. And the fallout? It didn't go her way. Several neighbors had filmed the encounter, police arriving, Sandra watching, the calm professionalism of it all. Within hours, videos started circulating online. One neighbor added narration. HOA president calls the cops on legal helicopter landing. Gets grounded by the law. Memes followed. My favorite? A chopper hovering above a cartoon Sandra screaming into a walkie-talkie. Code red, he's airborne again. Another showed her arguing with a neighbor, measuring tape in hand, trying to prove the landing pad was too close to a bush. Someone added dramatic orchestral music and called it Sandra versus the bush, dawn of delusion. At this point, I was landing once a week, not for the attention, but because I could. It was legal. It was therapeutic. It kept my flight skills sharp. Trent and I alternated flights, sometimes hauling in small supplies, sometimes just enjoying the ride. Neighbors treated it like a weekly event. Kids waved flags. Adults brought coffee. One guy even printed t-shirts that read, "Land it like you mean it." We weren't just making a statement. We were building community, something Sandra never managed to do. But I could feel the tension under the surface. Sandra had gone quiet, not because she was done, but because she was recalculating. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Then one morning, I walked outside and froze. Deep, deliberate claw marks were etched across the hood of my Jeep Gladiator. Not a random scratch. Not an accident. Intentional damage. No note. No witnesses. None of my cameras had captured the act, but I didn't need proof to know who it was meant for. This was personal. She wanted me to feel vulnerable. She wanted me to know there were consequences for winning. But instead of lashing out, I took a breath. I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, damage assessment. I quietly installed 2 new night vision cameras and upgraded the motion sensors on my property line. I contacted my lawyer and added it to the growing file labeled HOA harassment, Millbrook. This wasn't a petty feud anymore. Sandra had crossed the line from enforcement into obsession. She wasn't trying to uphold rules. She was trying to win a war she couldn't control. And I wasn't about to let her forget who she picked a fight with. Because if she thought a few scratches could ground me, she hadn't learned a damn thing. I wasn't just defending my Jeep anymore. I was defending the sky. And at exactly 2:17 a.m., that sky sent me a message. It was 2:17 a.m. when my phone chimed. One of the motion sensors I'd recently installed around the helipad had been triggered. I rubbed my eyes, opened the security app, and stared at the grainy black and white feed. There, at the edge of the pad, a figure crouched low, a spray can in hand. Another person stood a few feet away, scanning the street, clearly on lookout. I zoomed in, catching a blurry glimpse of a curly blonde bun under a pink hoodie. Sandra Millbrook. Of course it was her. I didn't move right away. I watched the footage for several minutes, documenting everything. The paint, the time, their faces. Then I quietly dressed, slipped out the side door, and approached the helipad. I stayed in the shadows, capturing the aftermath on video. By the time I returned inside, they were gone. The next morning, I walked outside like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Neighbors who once tiptoed around HOA politics were now openly taking sides, and more of them were drifting toward mine. I stood at the edge of the helipad, phone in hand, recording the scene. Giant, uneven red letters scrawled across the landing mat in dripping paint. It read, "No-fly zone," like a child had tried to spell a threat with finger paint. I turned the camera on myself and said, "Looks like some folks missed the memo on federal air rights. Stay tuned." Then I clipped the footage and sent it to my attorney. By noon, Officer Maya Rivera and another officer were on site. This time, I didn't need to convince anyone. Between the motion sensor data, the spray paint vandalism, and the existing harassment reports, they had more than enough to open an official case for trespassing and destruction of property. One of the officers even said, "This is the most detailed documentation I've ever seen in a neighborhood complaint." They took statements, bagged paint samples, and assured me they'd follow up. As the patrol car pulled away, I spotted Sandra across the street, arms crossed, sunglasses on, pretending to water a bush that had been dead for 3 months. She said nothing. Neither did I. But word spread fast. And this time, the outrage wasn't mine alone. Neighbors who had quietly cheered the helicopter landings were now visibly angry. People were done with the drama, the threats, and the fear. At the next HOA meeting, it was standing room only. You could feel it in the air. The tide had turned. Before Sandra could even call the meeting to order, a woman named Linda Sharp stood up and said, "We're done. We want to vote." Now, Sandra tried to protest, claimed it was improper procedure, that the board needed notice. Someone in the back shouted, "Then give us notice. We'll be back tomorrow." Another voice added, "Or we just call the state attorney general and ask how you've been running this HOA without holding elections." The room fell quiet. Sandra fumbled, eyes darting for backup. But it was gone. That night, half the board resigned. The rest scheduled an emergency re-election for the following week. Sandra had ruled Brookhaven Trails with intimidation and silence. But once that silence cracked, it was like a dam bursting. People who had never spoken up began sharing horror stories. Fines for bird feeders, citations for sidewalk chalk, even threats for leaving trash bins visible for more than 12 minutes after pickup. Someone even stood and read aloud an actual email Sandra had sent. "Please remind your children not to shriek or laugh excessively outdoors after 6 p.m. It was absurd, and everyone knew it. Still, she wasn't done. That weekend, while prepping the pad for another flight with Trent, I noticed something odd. A cluster of folding chairs, some orange cones, and a flimsy "Do Not Enter" sign zip-tied to a garden stake at the edge of the helipad. It looked more like a child's attempt at crowd control than any real blockade. But I knew who had placed it. A last-ditch move. Desperate. Designed to make it seem like the community had turned against me. I thought about moving it myself. Instead, I made a call. 10 minutes later, 2 squad cars rolled up. I waved them over, explained the stunt, and showed them my permit. The officers didn't just clear the blockade. They helped me move it off the lawn. I thanked them. One laughed and said, "Honestly, this beats writing speeding tickets." A small crowd had gathered again. And this time, nobody pretended they weren't watching. The crowd had gathered again. Phones out, lawn chairs lined up, kids waving like they were watching a parade. As Trent Dorsey's helicopter glided in low and landed perfectly in the center of the helipad, a ripple of cheers and clapping spread through the neighborhood. Across the street, Sandra Millbrook stood rigid, her sunglasses catching the late afternoon light. She glared with such intensity, one honestly thought she might melt the lenses. That night, I decided to end things with a little flair. I flew a slow, deliberate hover over Brookhaven Trails, not low enough to disturb anything, but just enough to get every head to turn skyward. Behind the Bell 206, I trailed a long custom banner that read, "Parked enough." It wasn't petty. It was poetry. The same woman who once claimed, "Your Jeep doesn't belong in this neighborhood," now stood watching a flying billboard sail over her house. A few neighbors laughed. Some clapped. One guy filmed the whole thing and uploaded it with the caption, "When HOA Sandra says no parking, so you take to the sky." But I didn't stop preparing. Even with Sandra losing her grip, I knew one last attack was coming. Legal, theatrical, or both. 2 days later, it arrived in my mailbox. A cease and desist letter from a law office I'd never heard of. It accused me of harassment, intimidation, and violating unwritten community airspace norms. It was vague, sloppy, barely coherent. My attorney, who had quietly enjoyed this saga as much as anyone, called and laughed. "This wouldn't hold up in front of a third-grade debate team," he said. Still, we took it seriously. We filed a formal response, backed by every permit, flight log, zoning clearance, and security record. Then we filed a counterclaim, harassment, defamation, and property damage. We included photos of the vandalized helipad, a list of 5 neighbor witnesses, and a printout of the spray-painted no-fly zone Sandra had left behind. At this point, she hadn't just lost the battle, she was losing the war. And the best part? She was doing it to herself. Over the next week, I noticed something unusual. Her front lawn, once manicured to HOA pamphlet perfection, had begun to brown at the edges. Her flower beds, usually pristine, were neglected. And her once daily patrols in the HOA golf cart had stopped altogether. For the first time, Sandra Millbrook didn't look powerful. She looked tired, deflated, like a balloon slowly losing air. It didn't make me feel triumphant. It just confirmed what I already suspected. People like Sandra don't thrive in transparency, they wilt. She never cared about harmony, only control. And now that control was slipping through her fingers. I didn't celebrate. I stayed professional, focused, because I knew this wasn't over. There was still one final vote, one last chance for Sandra to claw her way back into power. But this time I was ready. The morning of the final HOA vote dawned calm and silent, like the pause before a thunderstorm. I stood on my lawn, coffee in hand, watching the sun slowly warm the helipad. My olive-drab Jeep Gladiator sat in the driveway, freshly washed, gleaming like a statement piece. I hadn't moved it since receiving the cease and desist. I wanted it there, visible, unapologetic. By noon, the Brookhaven Trails Community Hall was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. I took a quiet seat near the front, nodding to neighbors who'd stood beside me. Even the ones who'd remained neutral now looked focused, fed up, and determined. Then Sandra walked in. She wore a beige pantsuit that looked like it had been pulled from a closet 2 decades too late. Her hair was curled tighter than ever, and her face was set like granite. She clutched her clipboard like it was a lifeline and walked stiffly to the board table, her final fortress. The meeting opened with routine items. No one cared. Everyone was waiting for item 12. Finally, Rick DeSoto, the HOA's long-frustrated vice president, stood up and cleared his throat. Item 12, he announced. Vote of no confidence in the acting president and proposal for immediate board restructuring. Sandra shot up, voice sharp. This motion is improper. It hasn't been reviewed by the compliance committee. Someone in the back yelled, "You disbanded that committee 6 months ago, Sandra." And just like that, the room shifted. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Then Rick DeSoto, vice president of the HOA, spoke evenly into the microphone. "You disbanded the compliance committee 6 months ago, Sandra. Remember?" The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Sandra Millbrook stammered something about procedure and decorum, but it was already too late. The momentum had shifted. A neighbor named Linda Sharp stood up and calmly handed out printed ballots. Another neighbor read the motion aloud. This resolution removes the acting president of the Brookhaven Trails HOA and calls for an open vote for a new board, effective immediately upon majority approval. It was clean. It was legal. And it was long overdue. The vote wasn't even close. The ballots were collected, then counted twice for transparency. Rick returned to the front of the room, cleared his throat, and announced the result. 87% in favor. Sandra Millbrook is hereby removed as HOA president. Effective immediately. Applause exploded. A few people jumped to their feet. Someone in the back let out a loud, joyous whistle. Sandra stood frozen, mouth slightly agape, trying to process the reality that her reign had ended, not with a bang, but with paperwork and applause. She didn't make a speech. She didn't threaten legal action. She just left. No one followed. For the first time since I'd moved to Brookhaven Trails, the neighborhood felt alive. People were cheering outside the hall, hugging, shaking hands. A kid ran up to me and asked if the helicopter would land again that weekend. I smiled. You better believe it. By the very next morning, a for sale sign appeared in Sandra's front yard. Just like that, she was gone. No farewell notes, no last-minute sabotage, no staged exit. It was almost anticlimactic. A moving truck arrived like a silent hearse to carry away the last remnants of her failed empire. I watched from my driveway as boxes were loaded into the truck. At one point, one of the movers knocked over her HOA Chair of the Year plaque. I didn't rush to help. Sandra gave me one last glare through the window of her SUV as it pulled away, but the fire in her eyes was gone. What remained was something hollow. Defeated. After her departure, the neighborhood changed quickly and beautifully. The new board repealed dozens of pointless HOA regulations. They opened public comment sessions and voted to refund excessive fines from the previous year. People brought decorations back to their front lawns. Kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sacs again without being scolded for being too enthusiastic. It felt like we had all been holding our breath for years and finally exhaled. To celebrate, I hosted a community barbecue. Everyone was welcome, even those who had stayed silent through the chaos. Trent Dorsey flew in with the helicopter and landed it gently just as the grill fired up. We had burgers, stories, a bounce house for the kids, and lawn games for the adults. Someone printed shirts that said, "Welcome to No-Fly Zone." I wore mine proudly. There were speeches, of course. A few neighbors thanked me for standing up when no one else had. I reminded them I wasn't the hero. I just had a unique skill set and a stubborn streak. They were the ones who showed up when it counted. Later that week, the video of Sandra's removal and the final vote was uploaded under the title, HOA Sandra Grounded by Helicopter Pilot. Full Community Revolt. It went viral almost overnight. Comments poured in from people across the country, sharing their own HOA horror stories and cheering for our peaceful rebellion. The banner flyover video was reposted hundreds of times, often with dramatic music and slow-motion edits. A national morning show even reached out and invited me to appear. I politely declined. This was never about going viral. It was about something deeper, principle. Weeks passed. Brookhaven trails settled into a calm, steady rhythm. I still flew occasionally, not to make a statement, but because I loved it. Trent and I even started offering short ride-alongs for the local kids, including Eli Tran, who now talked about becoming a pilot one day. We'd turned a battlefield into a runway. And one afternoon, as I returned from a routine flight, I found something waiting in my front yard, a handcrafted wooden plaque mounted on a metal stand. The engraving read, "To the man who parked in the sky when the ground got petty, thank you for helping us breathe again." Underneath, in smaller letters, "Your neighbors." I stood there quietly, letting the wind fade. It wasn't about the Jeep anymore, or the helicopter, or Sandra. It was about what happens when someone pushes back, not with rage, but with clarity. Not just for themselves, but for everyone watching from behind closed blinds. I never meant to start a neighborhood rebellion. I just wanted to park my Jeep. But sometimes, peace takes altitude. And sometimes, if you can't park it in the driveway, you land it on the lawn.